Welcome to tonight's story. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable, maybe lie down, close your eyes, and let the day drift away. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you can join us every night for more tales that help you relax and fall asleep peacefully. Now, let's step into the world of the King of Glass. In the year 1380, the bells of Paris tolled for a boy. He was just 11 years old, yet that day, he became the King of France. His name was Charles. Son of King Charles the Wise, a ruler known for his calm mind, his vast library, and his tireless efforts to maintain peace. But when the wise king died, the fragile peace he had built vanished almost immediately. The crown, heavy and cold, was placed on the small, unsteady head of his son, a child who barely understood what it meant to rule a kingdom. The court was alive with whispers. Uncles, dukes, and cousins circled the young king like predators, each smiling politely, bowing low, but plotting silently. Some spoke openly of loyalty, yet most moved with the quiet cunning of those who hungered for influence, wealth, and power. Every smile hid a dagger, every gesture contained a hidden meaning. The palace walls, grand and golden, were as much a cage as a throne room. France itself was a land of shadows. The 100 Years' War still raged beyond the borders, towns were emptied by famine and plague, and the Black Death had only recently loosened its grip, leaving fear and suspicion in its wake. Peasants whispered of death in the night, merchants counted losses, and nobles sharpened their swords. The country needed a strong hand, yet in the center of it all sat a child. Yet even in this chaos, young Charles shone. There was intelligence in his eyes, a quiet curiosity, a sense of the world beyond the palace walls. He loved the gardens, the stillness of the library, and the soft rustle of parchment as he read. He often wandered the corridors alone, imagining himself walking the streets of Paris unnoticed, blending with the people who adored yet feared their king. But the solitude was not comfort, it was the first taste of a life where trust was nearly impossible. The first nights on the throne were the hardest. He would lie awake in the gilded bedchamber, listening to the echo of footsteps in empty halls, wondering if any of those who bowed before him truly cared for him. Shadows danced on the walls as candlelight flickered, and the boy sometimes imagined they whispered secrets he was too young to understand. He felt the weight of the crown pressing on his head, heavier than he had ever imagined, and he sensed, even then, that power could both protect and destroy. And yet, despite his youth and the treachery surrounding him, Charles showed flashes of wisdom. He could recognize kindness when it came, a rare smile from a loyal servant, a whispered warning from a tutor who truly understood the boy's fragile mind. These small connections became the fragile threads keeping him tethered to the world outside his fears. But the court was patient and cunning, and the kingdom had little tolerance for innocence. They would later call him Charles the Mad. But that day, as the bells tolled, he was only Charles the Beloved. And somewhere deep within him, a flicker of the man he would become was already forming, brilliant, haunted, and destined to walk the thin line between genius and madness. The candles in the great hall flickered late into the night, casting long shadows on the cold stone walls. A quiet wind whispered through the open windows, carrying with it the distant cries of the city. And deep within the palace, in the chambers where no one dared enter, a whisper began, soft as a sigh, sharp as the first crack in glass, the whisper of a destiny that would shape France, and the fragile mind of a boy king who would one day be feared by all. Charles was still only a child when the weight of the crown began to press not only upon his head, but upon his very soul. His days were filled with lessons in statecraft, history, and diplomacy, yet no lesson could prepare him for the treachery of the court. Uncles who should have guided him whispered in shadows, dukes argued over borders and taxes as if the boy were invisible, and courtiers played their games of loyalty and deceit with the delicate threads of his childhood. He began to notice patterns. A smile that lingered too long could hide a knife. A sudden change in tone could signal betrayal. Every handshake, every bow, carried secrets, and every word he spoke might ripple through the kingdom in ways he could not yet understand. The palace, golden and magnificent, felt less like home and more like a labyrinth of mirrors, where nothing was as it seemed. At night, Charles would wander the corridors alone. The guards' footsteps echoed, the tapestry swayed as if alive, and the portraits of his ancestors seemed to watch him with eyes that held both judgment and pity. He often imagined himself as one of those ancestors, wise, strong, untouchable. Yet when he looked in the mirror, he saw only a boy, fragile and uncertain, swallowed by the enormity of the throne. He grew to distrust his own thoughts. When he trusted too easily, deception would find him. When he questioned everyone, isolation would follow. The boy king began to dream of invisible enemies, of plots that might not exist, of whispers in empty halls. It was a strange, dangerous clarity for someone so young, and yet it sharpened his mind in ways his tutors could not teach. France, meanwhile, tested him relentlessly. The war with England lingered, unending, bleeding the country dry. Nobles rebelled, towns rioted, and famine gnawed at the edges of the kingdom. Messages arrived daily, each carrying a new crisis, a border dispute, a tax revolt, a secret letter from a foreign court. Each decision Charles made, or delayed, could mean life or death for thousands. And though he was only a boy, he began to understand the terrible, lonely responsibility of power. Amid this chaos, he clung to small comforts. The royal gardens, filled with roses and fountains, became his sanctuary. The quiet library, with its ancient scrolls, offered a world where nothing could betray him. Tutors who truly cared for him became rare lifelines, guiding him with patience and caution. These were the moments that reminded Charles that the kingdom was not only a place of shadows, but also a place of wonder, beauty, and fleeting peace. Yet even in these quiet hours, the shadows were never far. The court continued its games. Advisors who had seemed loyal would turn against him. Allies became enemies. Friends vanished. And Charles, growing older and wiser, began to understand the terrible truth of what it meant to be king, that power could protect, but it could also corrupt. That trust was both a necessity and a danger. That the mind, especially a young one, could bend under the weight of crown and court alike. And so, the boy who would be king began to change. He became cautious, observant, and, above all, wary. He learned to watch the room before he spoke, to measure every word, to understand that appearances often mask deeper realities. He learned that a king's greatest weapon was not the sword or the army, but the knowledge of who could be trusted, and who could not. Charles did not yet know that this early wariness, this quiet vigilance, would be the first step on a path that would lead him into darkness. That the line between reality and imagination, between paranoia and truth, would grow thinner with each passing year. That the very crown he had once worn with wonder would one day feel like a cage of glass, fragile and deadly. And yet, in the quiet of his chambers, when the moonlight fell across the tapestries and the city slept beneath the castle walls, the boy still dreamed. He dreamed of a France that could flourish, of people who could be happy, of a world where a king could be both wise and kind. These dreams, delicate and fleeting, were the last remnants of the child who had once believed in the promise of his own reign. The shadows waited patiently. And somewhere deep within, the whisper that had begun on the night of his coronation grew louder, soft, insistent, like the first crack in glass that no one sees until it is too late. As Charles grew older, the burdens of the crown weighed heavier, pressing not only on his shoulders but on his very mind. The young king, once full of curiosity and quiet wonder, began to experience strange and frightening episodes. He would suddenly become withdrawn, staring at walls for hours, as if he could see things no one else could. Courtiers whispered behind closed doors, unsure whether to fear or pity him. Some claimed he was possessed, others that he had inherited a fragile mind from his ancestors. At night, the palace seemed alive with invisible threats. Shadows moved where no candlelight reached, and whispers echoed in corridors that should have been silent. Charles sometimes spoke to invisible figures, gave orders to unseen men, or insisted that his bedchamber was surrounded by enemies plotting against him. The tutors and advisors who had once guided him were bewildered, trying desperately to understand the boy who had become their king, yet every attempt to reach him was met with suspicion and fear. The first known episode that historians would later record happened in 1392. Charles, now in his mid-twenties, was traveling with his court to the City of Lions. Suddenly, in the midst of a meeting, he collapsed into a violent frenzy. He drew his sword and attacked those around him, believing they were conspirators sent to kill him. It took hours to calm him. Witnesses later described the scene as terrifying, a king in full rage, speaking nonsense in an unfamiliar voice, yet commanding authority with every motion. From that day forward, no one could deny that something had changed irreversibly in his mind. Despite this, Charles tried to continue ruling. France could not afford to have a weak king, and he was determined, in moments of clarity, to maintain his authority. He signed treaties, issued decrees, and held court as best he could. But the episodes became more frequent and more severe. The king who had once wandered gardens in solitude now feared every corridor, every shadow, every whisper. He insisted that invisible enemies plotted at every turn, that objects were cursed, that even the wind carried messages meant to harm him. The court learned to cope. Advisors learned which words to speak and which to avoid, which gestures might trigger the king's suspicion. Some fled, others stayed out of loyalty or fear. France, meanwhile, began to feel the effects. Wars continued, taxes were mismanaged, and the people noticed that their king, once their protector, seemed increasingly disconnected from reality. Yet they did not fully understand the magnitude of his condition. To many, he was still the king, to some, a symbol of the fragility of power itself. In private, Charles experienced moments of terrifying self-awareness. He knew something was wrong, that his mind betrayed him. He feared the very crown that should have symbolized strength. He began to isolate himself, sleeping in hidden chambers, wandering the castle at night, speaking only to those he trusted implicitly. He started to hide behind rituals and obsessions, small patterns that gave him a sense of control over the chaos within. And so the cracks deepened. The boy king who had once dreamed of France flourishing became a man trapped within a labyrinth of fear and suspicion. The whispers that had begun on the night of his coronation had grown into a storm, invisible yet unstoppable, echoing through every corner of the palace, shaping his thoughts, twisting reality, and marking the first step of a descent that would leave an indelible mark on history. The candlelight flickered in his private chambers, shadows stretching long across the walls. Somewhere, perhaps, an echo of the child he once was remained, fragile and fleeting, but the men who wore the crown of France now walked a path from which there could be no return. And deep within, a soft, insistent whisper, the first crack in glass, grew louder, promising a destiny both brilliant and terrifying. By the mid-1390s, Charles's episodes were no longer occasional, they had begun to dominate his life. The king who had once walked the palace gardens with quiet curiosity now wandered halls in fear, speaking to shadows, ordering guards to defend against invisible enemies, and sometimes refusing to eat, convinced that food had been poisoned. Courtiers whispered more boldly, some in fear, some in anger, others in disbelief. France was ruled by a king whose mind seemed to fracture with each passing day. One of the most infamous episodes occurred in 1393. Charles, convinced that his own men were plotting against him, rode into the streets of Paris with sword drawn. Citizens and nobles alike fled in terror as the king struck at anyone who dared approach. Historians later recorded that he attacked his own attendants, believing they were enemies disguised as friends. It took hours for guards to restrain him, and the city itself trembled under the shadow of his madness. From that moment, the fear of the king became as real as the love some still felt for him. Yet, in moments of clarity, Charles remained a man of extraordinary insight. He understood strategy, law, and diplomacy better than many of his advisors. He could speak with wisdom that belied his age and condition. But these moments were fleeting, swallowed quickly by paranoia and fear. The cracks in his mind allowed glimpses of brilliance, only to be replaced by chaos. Those who survived in his court learned to move carefully, reading the king's moods as one might read the shifting winds before a storm. Charles became obsessed with control. He inspected every detail of the palace, every document, every decree, fearing that a mistake, or a betrayal, might destroy him. He created elaborate rituals, demanding that certain guards be in specific positions at all times, that meals be prepared in precise order, that rooms be cleaned and arranged exactly as he commanded. Any deviation could trigger a violent outburst. The palace became a theater of tension, where every step and word were calculated, lest they provoke the fragile king. The people of France began to notice. They whispered about the mad king, and rumors spread across towns and villages. Some believed he was possessed, cursed by God, or touched by forces beyond understanding. Others pitied him, seeing only the boy who had once been crowned with hope and promise. And yet, life went on. Wars continued, taxes had to be collected, and the machinery of the kingdom ground forward, even under the shadow of a king whose mind could not always guide it. Charles himself was tormented by awareness. He feared that he might lose control entirely, that the whispers in his head might one day become reality. He sought solace in private chambers, in books, in long walks in the palace gardens at night, listening to the wind, hoping it might offer guidance. But the mind that once dreamed of France flourishing was now a labyrinth, filled with mirrors and shadows, where every sound and movement could be threat or deception. And so, the legend of the King of Glass was cemented. He was brilliant, yet broken. Powerful, yet fragile. Loved, yet feared. The line between reality and illusion grew thinner each day, until it seemed that any moment might bring catastrophe, not only for the king himself, but for the kingdom he ruled. The candles flickered in the vast halls of the palace, shadows stretching like long fingers across the walls. Somewhere deep within, the whisper, soft, persistent, and sharp as the first crack in glass, grew louder. It promised that nothing would ever be the same again, that the boy who once believed in his crown had entered a world from which he could not escape. By the late 1390s, Charles's episodes had transformed from rare disturbances into defining moments of his reign. The young king who had once wandered the palace gardens in quiet wonder now ruled under the shadow of fear, a fear that seemed to inhabit every stone of the palace, every whisper in the hall, every glance from his courtiers. He trusted no one completely, and yet he trusted some only partially, creating a delicate network of loyalty and suspicion that kept even the most cunning advisors on edge. One morning, Charles ordered that all the doors in the palace be sealed and inspected for secret passages. He demanded that his guards search for hidden poisons and charms in every meal. The court soon learned that nothing could escape his scrutiny. Candles were replaced with new ones at precise hours, tapestries were rearranged, and even the animals of the court were watched for signs of betrayal. Every small detail mattered, for Charles believed the tiniest flaw could trigger disaster. The king's fear extended beyond the palace. He became convinced that foreign powers were plotting against him at every turn. Envoys were questioned for hours, sometimes days, until they could prove their innocence. Letters were read and reread, examined for hidden meanings, and often destroyed out of suspicion. France, a kingdom already weary from war, began to feel the strain of a ruler who saw enemies in every corner. Yet, paradoxically, Charles's vigilance sometimes saved the kingdom from plots that others might have overlooked, proving that even madness can wield power. Despite this, moments of terror were relentless. On certain nights, Charles refused to sleep in his bed, believing it had been cursed. He wandered corridors in darkness, often speaking to the shadows as if they were loyal subjects. The court learned to anticipate these nights, to move quietly, to avoid drawing attention. Sometimes, the king would lash out violently, striking attendants or guards, only to apologize hours later, his memory of the incident erased by the very fear that had driven it. Outside the palace, the people began to murmur. Stories spread of a king who could not distinguish reality from illusion. Parents whispered warnings to children about the dangers of absolute power. Nobles wondered whether France could survive under a ruler so unpredictable. Yet, despite the fear and uncertainty, Charles remained king. The law, tradition, and the machinery of the kingdom demanded it. His power was absolute, even as his mind seemed increasingly fragile. And Charles himself felt the weight of every eye upon him. He knew that one misstep could destroy the kingdom or his life. Each decision was a careful calculation, a balance between reality and illusion. Yet no calculation could eliminate the terror that came from within. The whispers that had haunted him since his coronation had grown into a constant hum, a presence in every room, in every thought. They spoke of betrayal, of danger, of enemies that may or may not exist. In rare, fleeting moments of clarity, Charles would look out across the city from the palace windows and remember the boy who had once dreamed of France flourishing. He would imagine the streets full of life, the people living in peace, the land free from war and famine. But these visions were always fleeting. The shadows returned, the whispers returned, and the crown that should have been a symbol of authority felt more like a cage made of glass, fragile, sharp, and terrifying. And so, the legend of Charles the Mad deepened. Loved by some, feared by many, the boy who had become king was trapped in a world shaped by paranoia, obsession, and the cruel weight of absolute power. The palace became a theater of tension, and the kingdom a stage for a tragedy written in fear. The whisper, soft but insistent, the first crack in the glass of his mind, continued to grow, promising that the days ahead would test not only the king, but the very soul of France. By the turn of the century, Charles's episodes had become an unavoidable reality. The young king, once full of curiosity and quiet wonder, was now a man whose mind teetered on the edge of chaos. Every corner of the palace seemed alive with danger. Tapestries no longer hung as decoration but as warnings, doors were scrutinized as if hiding assassins, and even the whispers of servants could spark panic. The court had learned that survival required careful observation, patience, and, above all, silence. Charles's paranoia did not only concern his courtiers. He feared the streets of Paris, the murmurs of the people, the letters sent from foreign courts. Envoys from England, Burgundy, and Flanders were questioned relentlessly, sometimes kept for days, often accused of plots that existed only in the king's imagination. Documents were inspected repeatedly, and messages destroyed if any suspicion arose. While some advisors tried to shield the kingdom from chaos, the king's fear often dictated decisions, and the country sometimes paid dearly for his vigilance. Even daily routines were transformed by his obsession. Charles would wake at precise hours, perform rituals with his attendants, and demand exact arrangements for meals, guards, and chamber furniture. A misplaced candlestick or a slightly crooked tapestry could provoke fear and anger. He spoke often of invisible threats, of conspiracies that stretched beyond the palace walls, and insisted that hidden forces sought to destroy him. The king's reality had grown narrow, confined to corridors, chambers, and gardens, a fragile world where only he could judge truth. The more he isolated himself, the more vivid his visions became. Sometimes he believed that invisible enemies haunted his dreams, whispering threats while he slept. Other nights, he wandered the palace halls with a sword, striking at shadows or even attendants he believed had betrayed him. On one such night, chroniclers would later write, Charles attacked his own court, leaving noblemen bruised and terrified. It took hours to calm him, and even then, he could not recall the events clearly. Despite his mental fragility, Charles remained intelligent, calculating, and, in rare moments, brilliant. He issued decrees, negotiated treaties, and sometimes demonstrated insight far beyond his years. But these moments of clarity were fleeting. They could vanish in an instant, replaced by suspicion, fear, or violent episodes. Those who survived in his court learned to navigate this unpredictable landscape with caution, mastering the delicate balance between obedience and protection. The palace itself became a theater of tension. Guards watched not only for intruders but for the king's moods. Servants whispered quietly, careful not to draw attention. Advisors learned to anticipate the king's whims, understanding that a single misstep could result in punishment or worse. Even the architecture seemed to bend under the weight of fear. Corridors were patrolled constantly, doors inspected, windows reinforced. Every object, every sound, every shadow could be a threat. Outside the palace, France began to feel the effects of the king's instability. War continued along the borders. Rebellions flared in towns and villages. Famine and disease persisted. The king's absence, his episodes of fear and inaction, sometimes left the country vulnerable. And yet, paradoxically, his paranoia also prevented disasters, revealing plots that might have otherwise gone unnoticed. The kingdom lived in a fragile balance, teetering between brilliance and catastrophe. Charles himself oscillated between clarity and chaos. In quiet moments, he would walk the palace gardens at night, observing the moonlight on fountains and statues, imagining the France he had once dreamed of as a child, peaceful, strong, and flourishing. But these moments were brief. Soon, the shadows returned, whispers returned, and the crown that should have been a symbol of authority now felt like a cage of glass, fragile, sharp, and oppressive. It was during these years that the legend of the King of Glass became entrenched. The boy who had once been crowned with hope and promise was now a man haunted by paranoia, fear, and obsession. The whispers that had begun on the night of his coronation had grown into a storm, unseen but relentless. France watched, trembled, and endured under a king whose brilliance and madness were inseparable. And deep within the palace, as the candles flickered and the shadows stretched long across the stone walls, the first cracks in the king's mind continued to grow. They whispered of betrayal, danger, and isolation. They promised that the days ahead would be defined not only by war and politics, but by the fragile, fractured mind of a man who carried the weight of a kingdom on his shoulders, a king whose destiny would forever be intertwined with fear, madness, and the haunting beauty of his own imagination. By the early 1400s, Charles's episodes had become both infamous and terrifying. The king who had once been a boy wandering gardens now ruled under the shadow of his own mind. He saw enemies everywhere, in courtiers, servants, even close family. Advisors had to navigate a labyrinth of suspicion, knowing that a single misstep could provoke anger or worse. It was said that Charles trusted no one completely, and that the line between friend and foe could shift in a moment. During this time, regents and advisors tried to govern in his name during his frequent incapacitations. Uncles, dukes, and relatives took turns ruling, yet their authority was always fragile. Charles's paranoia made them both powerful and vulnerable. They could act only when the king allowed, but they could never entirely escape his gaze. Some sought to manipulate his fear for their own gain, while others genuinely tried to protect him and the kingdom. Each day was a tense dance between loyalty, ambition, and survival. The king's episodes grew more elaborate and public. On several occasions, Charles would enter council chambers shouting that spies had infiltrated the palace, accusing ministers of treason, and demanding their immediate punishment. Nobles learned to tread carefully, reading the king's mood like a map of minefields. He could forgive one day, but a single suspicious glance the next could trigger fury. The court became an invisible theater, where nothing was as it seemed and every movement was calculated. Even in private, Charles could not escape the shadows. He refused to sleep in his own chambers at times, wandering the halls at night with sword in hand, convinced that plots against him were everywhere. He demanded the doors be locked, windows watched, and servants stationed as if preparing for a siege. Every object, from candlesticks to tapestries, was examined for hidden threats. The king's reality had become a fragile world of rituals, observation, and fear. Despite this, Charles retained extraordinary insight during brief moments of clarity. He negotiated treaties, studied statecraft, and made decisions that preserved France in times of turmoil. Yet these moments were fleeting, often followed by paranoia and episodes of violent fear. The court had to adapt to the unpredictable ruler, creating systems of caution and secrecy that would make even the most loyal advisors nervous. The legend of the King of Glass deepened. To outsiders, he was unpredictable, dangerous, even otherworldly. To the people of France, he was a symbol of fragility, a ruler whose brilliance and madness were inseparable. And in the quiet of the palace, as candles flickered and shadows stretched long across the stone walls, the whisper of his own mind, soft, insistent, relentless, promised that no day would be like the last, that the cracks in the king's mind would grow deeper, shaping the fate of both ruler and kingdom. Charles's world had shrunk to the palace walls. The corridors, once a place of exploration and quiet curiosity, had become an intricate web of fear, observation, and obsession. He wandered endlessly at night, speaking to shadows as if they were loyal subjects, ordering guards to positions invisible to everyone else, inspecting doors and windows for threats. Even the tapestries that adorned the walls seemed to him like conspirators, hiding dangers that only he could perceive. The court had adapted to this reality. Nobles moved carefully, servants whispered cautiously, and advisors learned to predict which rituals or gestures would appease the king on any given day. A misplaced object, a forgotten word, a glance in the wrong direction could provoke panic or rage. And yet, Charles's insights were unmatched. He could read people and situations with extraordinary clarity, making decisions that preserved the kingdom even amidst his episodes. It was a paradox, a ruler whose mind was breaking, yet whose instinct and intelligence remained formidable. The episodes grew more complex. On some days, Charles would refuse to eat, convinced that poisons had been hidden in every meal. On others, he would attack his own attendants, only to apologize hours later as if the event had never occurred. He spoke of invisible enemies, spies, and conspiracies, often giving orders to guards or officials that made sense only in his own mind. The palace became a stage where reality and illusion blurred, and the king's perceptions dictated the movements of everyone around him. Even as his mind fractured, Charles held on to moments of clarity. In these rare times, he would walk through the gardens, observing the fountains, statues, and moonlit paths. He remembered the France he had once dreamed of as a child, a country of peace, prosperity, and hope. But the shadows always returned, and with them, the fear, obsession, and whispers that haunted him since his coronation. The crown, once a symbol of authority and promise, had become a fragile cage of glass, sharp and unyielding, containing both the man and his madness. France continued to endure. Wars waged, towns rebelled, and the people whispered tales of a king who could not always distinguish truth from illusion. Yet despite the fear and instability, Charles remained ruler. His episodes shaped the kingdom as much as his decisions, forcing nobles, ministers, and citizens alike to adapt to a world governed by a fragile mind. And somewhere deep within the palace, the soft, relentless whisper, the first crack in the glass, continued to grow, shaping not only the king but the fate of France itself. By the early 1400s, Charles's mind had become a landscape of shadows. The once brilliant boy king now ruled in fits of clarity and terror. The court had learned to anticipate his moods, the guards moved silently like phantoms, and the advisors navigated a maze of fear, loyalty, and treachery. The throne itself seemed to crack under the weight of his mind, and France teetered on the brink between governance and chaos. Charles's paranoia extended to his own family. He accused relatives of plotting against him, sometimes publicly, sometimes in private. Cousins, uncles, and even close advisors found themselves scrutinized, interrogated, or isolated. The palace became a theater of suspicion, every hallway a stage for imagined conspiracies. Even the king's advisors who genuinely sought to protect him had to act with caution, aware that the line between loyalty and betrayal was invisible and shifting. One of the most notorious episodes occurred when Charles, convinced that a conspiracy threatened the kingdom, ordered that several nobles be confined in the palace for questioning. Hours turned into days, and the men were kept under strict surveillance, their every word recorded and analyzed. The king, in the midst of a frenzy, drew a sword at one point, demanding confessions from invisible enemies. Courtiers watched in fear, some whispering prayers, others quietly plotting how to survive the storm of madness. Despite the chaos, Charles could still govern when clarity returned. He signed treaties, made military decisions, and continued to navigate France through the ongoing conflicts with England and Burgundy. These moments of lucidity made him both respected and feared, as no ruler could match his intelligence when the storm of madness receded. Yet the episodes were growing longer, more severe, and increasingly disruptive to the life of the kingdom. France itself felt the strain. Towns bristled with unrest, armies sometimes acted without clear command, and taxation grew erratic. The king's absence in critical moments, combined with unpredictable fits of paranoia, created instability. The people whispered of a fragile throne, of a kingdom at the mercy of a man trapped in his own mind. And yet, for all the fear, Charles remained sovereign, a paradoxical figure whose authority was absolute despite the cracks in his psyche. The whispers inside his mind continued, growing louder, more insistent. He began to see threats in every shadow, every servant, every visitor. The palace had become a fortress not only against the world but against the chaos within his own thoughts. And deep inside, beneath the fear, the King of Glass was aware that his life and the life of France balanced on a razor's edge, that the smallest misstep could shatter everything. By this stage of his reign, Charles's episodes had become public knowledge, yet they continued to baffle historians and contemporaries alike. The king's fits of paranoia and madness were not confined to the palace walls, they affected decisions of war, diplomacy, and governance. The fragile balance of France depended on the moments when Charles's mind was clear, yet even these moments were short-lived, fleeting like a candle flame in the wind. One notorious day, Charles, convinced of a plot against his life, refused to leave his chambers. He demanded that no one enter, that the city gates be sealed, and that loyal guards patrol every corridor. Messages went unread, councils were postponed, and the machinery of the kingdom slowed. France, already weary from decades of conflict, felt the strain. Nobles whispered of rebellion, yet dared not act, for the king's mind was unpredictable, and his wrath could be sudden and lethal. At night, Charles wandered the halls, sword in hand, speaking to shadows. Sometimes he would accuse his advisors of treachery, sometimes he would order elaborate searches for invisible spies. Candles flickered in the long corridors, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with him, feeding his fear. Even familiar rooms felt dangerous. Every object, every movement, every sound could conceal a threat. Yet in these dark days, moments of clarity shone like fragile stars. Charles could still negotiate treaties, manage military strategy, and protect his kingdom from external threats. These periods were brief but crucial, allowing France to survive despite the chaos within its ruler's mind. The people, witnessing the fragile oscillation between brilliance and madness, grew both fearful and awed by their king. Family and regents began to intervene more openly. They attempted to guide the kingdom during his episodes, sometimes with diplomacy, sometimes with force. Charles's relationships with them were tense, unpredictable. He both relied on them and feared their influence, creating a complex web of loyalty, suspicion, and power struggles. Every decision, every action, every word was weighed with careful calculation, yet the shadow of his madness hung over all. France itself lived on the edge, caught between war, internal strife, and the fragile reign of a king whose mind was fracturing before the eyes of the court and the people. The king of glass, brilliant, intelligent, and terrifyingly unstable, was now both ruler and prisoner of his own mind. The whispers that began on the night of his coronation had grown into a storm, invisible yet unstoppable, shaping the destiny of the kingdom, the palace, and the men who wore the crown. And as the candles flickered late into the night, casting long shadows across the stone walls, the whisper inside the king's mind continued, soft yet relentless, sharp as the first crack in glass, promising that nothing would ever be the same, and that the story of Charles the Mad had only begun to unfold. By the mid-1400s, Charles's episodes had grown both more frequent and more public. The palace, once a symbol of grandeur and order, had become a labyrinth of fear, observation, and ritual. Every hallway, corridor, and chamber seemed alive with danger in the eyes of the king. Candles flickered like ghostly sentinels, shadows danced across the stone walls, and the whisper inside his mind, soft yet persistent, never ceased. At night, Charles often walked the corridors alone, sword in hand, inspecting every door and window. He would speak to shadows, issuing orders that made sense only to him, demanding loyalty from those who could not see the enemies he imagined. Sometimes, servants would hear him shouting at invisible spies or ordering punishments for conspiracies that did not exist. His episodes became a terrifying spectacle, a king consumed by the unseen, the imagined, the whispering fear that haunted his every step. The court had adapted to survive. Advisors learned which words to speak and which to avoid. Nobles and attendants moved with deliberate caution, anticipating the king's whims and moods. The palace itself had been transformed by these routines, doors were reinforced, corridors patrolled, objects inspected and rearranged to satisfy rituals that provided the king a sense of control. Survival required constant vigilance. Despite his instability, Charles retained flashes of brilliance. He could issue decrees, manage diplomatic negotiations, and make strategic decisions that saved the kingdom from disasters his advisors might have overlooked. These moments, fleeting yet powerful, reminded everyone that beneath the madness lay a ruler of extraordinary intellect. Yet they were always overshadowed by paranoia, fear, and episodes of uncontrollable rage or retreat into isolation. The people of France began to whisper more boldly. The King of Glass became a figure of fascination, fear, and legend. Tales spread of his night wanderings, his attacks on invisible enemies, and the fragile crown he wore with trembling hands. Despite the chaos, Charles remained sovereign. His authority, paradoxically absolute, rested on the delicate balance between brilliance and madness, fear and loyalty. The moonlight often cast strange patterns on the palace walls, turning familiar halls into shifting, alien landscapes. To Charles, these patterns were sometimes messages, sometimes threats, sometimes glimpses of truths no one else could see. And deep inside, the soft, relentless whisper, the first crack in glass, continued to grow, shaping a destiny that would forever intertwine the king, his crown, and the kingdom he ruled. By now, the court lived in a state of constant tension. Charles's paranoia dictated every decision, every ritual, every interaction. Nobles whispered behind screens, servants tiptoed along corridors, and advisors calculated each word before speaking. The palace was no longer a home, but a stage of constant vigilance, where a single misstep could ignite fear or violence. Charles's fear extended beyond the palace walls. Envoys from foreign courts were questioned, sometimes held for days, and often accused of plotting assassinations. Letters were examined obsessively, documents scrutinized for hidden threats. Even the food he ate, the candles he lit, the very air of the palace became a matter of suspicion. Every detail, no matter how small, could provoke an episode of fear or fury. Despite this, the king occasionally demonstrated remarkable clarity. He could negotiate treaties, manage military campaigns, and govern with precision. These fleeting moments of lucidity reminded all who served him that he was still a brilliant ruler, capable of protecting the kingdom. Yet the episodes of paranoia and delusion grew more severe, increasingly shaping the life of France. The balance between madness and governance was delicate, and the kingdom hung in uncertainty. Family members and regents began to intervene more openly. Uncles and cousins tried to guide the kingdom during his incapacitations, often clashing with one another, sometimes with loyalty, sometimes with ambition. The palace became a theater of political intrigue, as each figure sought to maintain power while navigating the unpredictable mind of their king. Even the most trusted advisors had to tread carefully, for the line between service and perceived betrayal was perilously thin. Charles himself experienced terrifying moments of self-awareness. He understood, at least fleetingly, that his mind was breaking, that the crown he wore had become a fragile cage, sharp and dangerous. These realizations only deepened his paranoia, making him more suspicious, more ritualistic, and more withdrawn. The whispers that had haunted him since his coronation were now inseparable from his consciousness, guiding his fear, shaping his thoughts, and influencing the decisions that affected the entire kingdom. France, meanwhile, continued to survive, despite the fragile rule of a king consumed by madness. The people whispered of the King of Glass, of his brilliance and instability, of the shadows that followed him even in daylight. Wars waged, towns struggled, and the machinery of governance faltered at times, yet the kingdom endured. And in the quiet of the palace, as candlelight flickered on stone walls and shadows danced, the soft, insistent whisper continued, shaping a destiny defined by fear, fragility, and the haunting brilliance of a king whose mind teetered between genius and madness. By the 1410s, Charles's episodes had escalated into something both legendary and terrifying. The king, haunted by shadows and whispers, began to hold what some chroniclers would call the midnight court. At night, he would summon advisors, nobles, and attendants to council chambers that were darkened, candlelight flickering, shadows leaping across stone walls. He would question them for hours, accusing some of conspiracies, others of lying, while invisible enemies were believed to lurk behind tapestries or under tables. The court had learned to survive these nights. Every word was measured, every gesture calculated. Servants moved with silent precision, guarding themselves as much as the king. Advisors would nod to accusations they knew were baseless, offering appeasement to prevent wrath. Nobles whispered in corridors, plotting not only survival but occasionally their own advantage in a palace governed as much by fear as by law. The midnight court became a performance of tension, a place where reality and imagination collided, and where the line between loyalty and betrayal could shift in an instant. Charles's fear was not limited to people. Objects, rooms, and even the wind became vessels of danger in his mind. Candles could hide poisons, tapestries could conceal spies. The palace, once a home of grandeur, was now a labyrinth of threats. Guards patrolled corridors not only to protect the king from external danger but also to defend themselves from the unpredictable violence of the ruler they served. Yet, in rare intervals, the brilliance of the king shone through. Decisions made during these moments were astonishing in their foresight and clarity, preserving France from diplomatic disasters or military errors. Charles's mind, fractured as it was, retained flashes of genius. But these moments were always precarious, fleeting islands amid a sea of paranoia and fear. The midnight court became both a symbol of terror and a reminder of power. France watched, worried and awed. The king's condition shaped politics, alliances, and the daily life of the kingdom. And in the quiet moments when the candles burned low and the shadows stretched across empty halls, the whisper in Charles's mind, the first crack in glass, promised that the story of the King of Glass would unfold in ways no one could predict. The palace had become a labyrinth, not only of stone and corridors, but of the king's fractured mind. Charles wandered endlessly, fearing betrayal in every shadow, conspiracies in every whisper. Doors were locked, windows watched, tapestries inspected, and meals scrutinized. Servants tiptoed along corridors, whispering, calculating, adapting to the unpredictable ruler whose mind blurred the line between reality and illusion. Charles began to see patterns where none existed, connections invisible to all others. He believed foreign powers were secretly plotting, envoys were disguised spies, and advisors were playing roles in a conspiracy only he could perceive. Even family members were not exempt. Cousins and uncles were subject to sudden interrogations or confinement, often without reason. The court became a tense theater of survival, loyalty, and subtle manipulation, shaped entirely by the fragile mind of the King of Glass. At times, Charles would enter violent frenzies, striking at those he imagined as enemies. Other times, he would withdraw completely, refusing to eat, speak, or leave his chambers for days. His advisors learned to act as both protectors and interpreters of the king's will, guiding France through crises even as the ruler himself teetered on the edge of madness. The kingdom itself seemed to live at the mercy of an unseen storm, one that began in the palace but reached every corner of the land. Yet amidst the chaos, Charles retained brilliance. His knowledge of statecraft, diplomacy, and military strategy remained extraordinary. Decisions he made in moments of clarity preserved France from disasters that might have destroyed weaker kingdoms. But the price of these moments was high. Each episode of paranoia, rage, or fear created a ripple of tension that affected everyone in the palace and beyond. The labyrinth extended beyond the walls of the palace. France itself felt the consequences of a king whose mind was fragile, unpredictable, and brilliant in equal measure. Towns whispered of the mad king, nobles tread carefully, and foreign powers observed the instability with interest and fear. The King of Glass, brilliant and terrifying, continued to walk a path defined by shadows, whispers, and the delicate tension between genius and madness. And deep within the palace, in chambers no one dared enter, the soft, insistent whisper, the first crack in glass, continued to grow. It promised that the days ahead would be shaped not only by war, politics, and intrigue, but by the fragile, fractured mind of Charles himself, a king whose destiny and the fate of France were now inseparably intertwined. By the mid-1410s, France was a kingdom both threatened by external enemies and shaken by its own ruler. Charles's mind had fractured further, and his episodes of paranoia and delusion began to influence military and diplomatic decisions. The ongoing conflict with England, the 100 Years' War, required a steady hand, yet France was now at the mercy of a king whose mind blurred reality and illusion. Advisors intervened constantly, attempting to guide armies and negotiate alliances while anticipating the unpredictable demands of the king. Charles himself believed he was surrounded by traitors. He suspected his generals of plotting with the English, and he feared that foreign envoys sought to poison him through letters, gifts, or even the air he breathed. Entire regiments were sometimes reassigned not for strategic reasons but to satisfy his suspicions. The army became a reflection of his fragile mind, disciplined yet constantly teetering on the edge of chaos. Amid this turmoil, moments of astonishing clarity would appear. Charles would make decisions that prevented disasters, uniting factions, or repelling invasions with unexpected brilliance. These fleeting flashes reminded the kingdom that beneath the madness remained a ruler of extraordinary insight. Yet they were always temporary. Soon, paranoia, fear, and obsession would return, dictating policies and plunging the kingdom into crises that might have been avoided. The court had become a tense web of survival. Advisors, nobles, and family members acted as intermediaries, interpreters, and protectors. They whispered, schemed, and predicted the king's moods, often saving France from the consequences of decisions made in fear or delusion. Yet even the most loyal advisors were never truly safe. A misstep could provoke sudden rage, a violent episode, or accusations of treason. Charles's condition began to influence the public perception of the monarchy. Towns whispered of the King of Glass, and foreign powers watched closely, considering both opportunity and danger. The kingdom's stability depended as much on his moments of clarity as on the skill of those around him, a precarious balance that could shift with the slightest provocation. By now, the episodes of Charles had taken on an almost ritualistic pattern, many occurring at night under the silver light of the moon. He would wander palace corridors alone, sometimes speaking to shadows, sometimes striking at invisible enemies. Candles flickered in the stone halls, casting long, distorted shapes that seemed to him like spies, traitors, or demons sent to harm him. The palace had become a theater where reality and delusion intertwined, and where survival required constant vigilance from all who dwelled within. On certain nights, Charles refused to sleep, pacing the corridors for hours. He demanded guards remain at precise positions, inspected doors, windows, and even tapestries for threats, and sometimes ordered the palace to be sealed entirely. Servants learned to move silently, anticipating his needs and fears, while nobles navigated a minefield of suspicion and ritual, careful not to draw his wrath. Even the faintest sound could spark an episode of terror. Despite this, moments of lucidity reminded all of the king's brilliance. Charles could, at times, plan campaigns, issue orders, and make strategic decisions that preserved France's fragile stability. His insight was extraordinary, a sharp contrast to the madness that dominated his nights. The contrast made the kingdom's survival as remarkable as it was precarious. The whisper within Charles's mind, the first crack in glass, had become constant, guiding, warning, and shaping his perceptions. It fed his paranoia, yet also sharpened his intuition in strange and unexpected ways. The kingdom, the court, and even the king himself were trapped in a delicate dance, each movement dictated by fear, insight, and the fragile balance between genius and madness. France watched, waited, and endured. Towns and armies, advisors and family, nobles and commoners, all adjusted their lives around the king's condition. The moonlit madness became part of the legend, stories whispered in towns, recorded in chronicles, and recounted by historians, a king brilliant yet broken, whose mind both saved and endangered the kingdom. And in the quiet moments, when shadows lengthened across the palace halls and the moon cast its pale light on stone and tapestry, the whisper, soft, insistent, unrelenting, promised that the story of the King of Glass was far from over. That even in the darkest nights, the fragile crown would continue to shape France, and the fate of the kingdom would forever hinge on the delicate, terrifying brilliance of Charles himself. By the late 1410s, Charles's episodes had begun to occur not only in the private chambers but in public, terrifying witnesses and reshaping the perception of the monarchy. On several occasions, the king appeared before his court in a frenzy, attacking attendants, shouting accusations, and giving orders that seemed nonsensical to those around him. Nobles whispered behind screens, while ambassadors and foreign envoys watched in disbelief, unsure whether to intervene or flee. One infamous incident saw Charles striking at his own advisors, convinced they had conspired with foreign enemies. Guards restrained him only after hours of chaos, yet he sometimes forgot the events almost immediately, resuming court duties as if nothing had happened. These public episodes became a spectacle, leaving the people in awe and fear, and forever marking France with the legend of the King of Glass. The court, meanwhile, adapted to survive these unpredictable moments. Advisors developed a complex system of appeasement and precaution. Certain rituals and routines were introduced to calm the king, while family members and trusted nobles learned to anticipate triggers for his paranoia. The palace itself had been transformed into a labyrinth of observation, every room prepared for potential crisis, every shadow treated as a potential threat. Yet amidst the chaos, flashes of brilliance remained. In quieter moments, Charles could negotiate treaties, manage the kingdom's finances, and provide insight into military strategy. These rare intervals of clarity reinforced the paradox of the King of Glass, brilliant yet fragile, feared yet necessary, a ruler whose mind was both a weapon and a danger. France, observing this spectacle, felt the weight of uncertainty. Towns and villages whispered rumors, foreign powers watched closely, and even the closest advisors understood that the fate of the kingdom was inseparable from the fragile mind of its king. And in the quiet of the palace, as candlelight flickered across stone walls, the whisper inside Charles's mind, the first crack in glass, grew louder, shaping both the men and the destiny of the kingdom he ruled. By now, the crown itself had become a symbol not of power but of vulnerability. Charles, once a young king of quiet wonder, was now a ruler whose mind wavered between genius and terror. He feared betrayal in every gesture, threat in every shadow. Advisors, family members, and servants adapted to this fragile reality, learning to read moods, anticipate rituals, and survive the unpredictable oscillations of the king's psyche. At night, Charles wandered palace corridors, sword in hand, inspecting doors, windows, and tapestries. He whispered to shadows, issued commands to invisible soldiers, and sometimes lashed out at attendants, convinced they were conspirators. The palace had become a theater of tension, where survival required constant vigilance, and where the line between reality and illusion was impossible to discern. Yet in moments of clarity, Charles remained a brilliant strategist and perceptive ruler. He managed military campaigns, forged alliances, and navigated the turbulent waters of French politics. These moments reminded all who served him that beneath the fragile, fractured exterior was a mind capable of extraordinary insight. But such clarity was fleeting, and soon the paranoia and obsession returned, dictating decisions and influencing the kingdom itself. The people of France, witnessing the fragile crown, felt a mixture of awe and fear. Stories spread of a king whose mind was brilliant yet broken, whose reign was defined by moments of genius and episodes of terror. Foreign powers monitored France closely, calculating opportunities while fearing the unpredictability of the King of Glass. Within the palace, whispers and careful observations shaped every action, creating a delicate web of loyalty, caution, and survival. And deep within, in the quiet moments when candles flickered and shadows stretched across stone walls, the first crack in glass continued to grow. It promised that the story of Charles the Mad, brilliant, fragile, terrifying, was far from over. That the kingdom, the palace, and the men who wore the crown were bound together in a fragile, unbreakable destiny that would continue to unfold in ways both brilliant and terrifying. By the early 1420s, Charles's episodes had begun to influence not only the internal court but the very survival of France. Wars with England and internal rebellions required coordination, yet the king's mind often slipped into paranoia, withdrawing him from decision-making or sending the court into chaos with erratic commands. Advisors and regents were forced to govern in his stead, yet they had to navigate the constant fear that any action could provoke sudden wrath. Charles's public episodes became increasingly dramatic. He would ride through palace corridors shouting accusations, strike attendants, and sometimes demand impossible actions from his council. At times, he refused to see foreign envoys, convinced they were disguised spies plotting to poison him. Entire negotiations stalled, armies delayed, and the machinery of government slowed. France lived under the shadow of a king whose mind wavered between brilliance and terror, and whose every action or inaction shaped the fate of the kingdom. Family members and regents acted as stabilizers, but tensions grew. Ambitions collided as they sought to preserve the kingdom while maintaining their own influence. Some whispered against one another, some attempted subtle manipulations, while all navigated the king's unpredictable moods. Charles, aware of betrayal even where none existed, oscillated between trust and suspicion, creating a court dominated by tension and fear. The whisper in Charles's mind, the first crack in glass, continued to grow, guiding his paranoia and feeding his imagination of conspiracies. Yet even amidst this mental storm, moments of clarity emerged. The king could still make strategic decisions, preserve alliances, and avert disaster. These flashes, however fleeting, reminded all that the King of Glass remained extraordinarily capable, even as his crown trembled on his head, fragile as ever. As Charles aged into the 1420s, the episodes became longer, more severe, and increasingly public. The king wandered corridors at night, conversed with shadows, and issued commands to invisible enemies. Candles flickered, casting distorted shadows that seemed alive. Attendants and guards moved with silent precision, anticipating his fears and protecting both themselves and the fragile king. The palace had become a theater of tension, every room a potential stage for madness. Charles's influence over France was paradoxical. While his episodes threatened stability, his moments of clarity preserved the kingdom from external threats. Military campaigns, diplomatic negotiations, and internal governance were conducted through intermediaries who constantly monitored the king's condition. France survived, but the shadow of his mind loomed over every decision, every battle, every treaty. At court, fear and intrigue intertwined. Advisors and nobles navigated the fragile balance between service, survival, and ambition. Even family members acted cautiously, aware that a misstep could provoke the king's rage or suspicion. The fragile crown, once a symbol of authority, had become a cage, sharp and unyielding, containing a brilliant yet unstable ruler. Physically, Charles began to show the toll of years of stress, fear, and psychological strain. Episodes of lapsed memory, fatigue, and emotional volatility increased. Yet the whispers in his mind, the first crack in glass, remained, guiding both paranoia and intuition. France, the palace, and the man himself were bound together in a delicate, terrifying dance of survival and brilliance. And in the quiet moments, when shadows stretched across the palace halls and candlelight flickered, the King of Glass remained, a ruler both fragile and formidable, whose destiny was inseparably linked to the fate of the kingdom. The whispers promised that the story was far from over, that the crown, the palace, and the fragile mind of Charles would continue to shape France in ways brilliant, terrifying, and unforgettable. By the mid-1420s, the instability of Charles's mind began to have dramatic consequences on France's alliances and political stability. Foreign powers, once wary of French strength, now watched closely, noting the king's unpredictable behavior. England, Burgundy, and other neighboring states considered opportunities and threats simultaneously, as France's leadership became a reflection of the fractured mind of its king. Decisions were delayed, instructions misinterpreted, and treaties stalled, creating ripples across the continent. Charles's paranoia intensified. He suspected that foreign ambassadors were secretly plotting his downfall. Letters were read multiple times, inspected for hidden meanings, and sometimes burned entirely. Envoys grew cautious, adapting their behavior to avoid raising suspicion, yet even the most subtle gesture could provoke fear. The court became a theater of diplomacy conducted in whispers, secrecy, and anticipation of sudden outbursts. Internally, the palace was a crucible of tension. Advisors and family members jockeyed for influence while attempting to protect both the king and the kingdom. They had to anticipate his moods, soothe his fears, and prevent episodes that could result in public chaos or dangerous decisions. Even those closest to Charles understood that loyalty could be questioned at any moment, and survival depended on navigating the fragile landscape of his mind. Despite these challenges, flashes of brilliance persisted. Charles could still offer insights into military strategy, governance, and diplomacy. His intuitive grasp of complex matters allowed France to survive external threats, yet the kingdom remained fragile, constantly at the mercy of a ruler whose mind could collapse without warning. The crown, delicate and heavy, had become both symbol and prison, guiding, threatening, and containing the king simultaneously. By this time, Charles's internal struggles had begun to affect the most critical aspects of France's survival. He fought battles not only on the fields of war but within his own mind. Episodes of paranoia, delusion, and fear dictated moments of governance, often without anyone else's knowledge. Military campaigns were influenced by sudden fears, diplomatic relations by imagined conspiracies, and internal policy by obsessive rituals. The king's mind had become an unseen battlefield, where every decision carried enormous weight. At night, Charles wandered the palace corridors, speaking to invisible enemies, inspecting doors, and ordering guards to positions unseen by anyone else. He sometimes refused to eat or sleep, convinced that poisons or plots awaited him. Candles flickered across stone walls, creating shadows that seemed alive, reinforcing the whispers in his mind. Attendants moved cautiously, anticipating his demands and protecting themselves, often fearing for their lives as much as for the kingdom. The court had adapted to survive. Advisors, family members, and loyal nobles developed intricate routines to prevent chaos. They learned to interpret subtle cues, predict episodes, and implement strategies to manage both internal and external crises. France's survival depended as much on their skill as on Charles's moments of clarity. Even amidst the instability, the king demonstrated flashes of brilliance. He could plan military strategies, negotiate treaties, and make decisions that preserved the kingdom from disaster. These rare periods of lucidity reinforced the paradox of the King of Glass: fragile, unstable, yet remarkably capable. The whispers that haunted him, the first cracks in glass, guided both fear and intuition, shaping France's destiny even as the palace trembled under the weight of uncertainty. And as candlelight flickered and shadows stretched across the stone halls, Charles remained both ruler and prisoner, a man whose mind dictated the survival of a nation. The kingdom, the palace, and the fragile crown were bound together, a delicate and terrifying dance of power, fear, and brilliance, a story that would continue to unfold in ways both remarkable and haunting. By the late 1420s, Charles's instability forced his family and closest advisors to intervene more openly. The regents, often his uncles and trusted nobles, had to govern in his stead during his prolonged episodes of fear, paranoia, and delusion. They faced a constant dilemma: act decisively to maintain the kingdom's stability, yet avoid provoking the king's wrath, which could undo all progress in an instant. The palace became a place of silent calculation. Courtiers whispered strategies, measured words, and observed the king's slightest movements. Even minor gestures could be interpreted as signs of betrayal, and advisors learned to anticipate the king's moods with painstaking precision. The regents had to balance loyalty, survival, and the fragile authority of the crown, understanding that one misstep could create chaos both within the palace and across France. Charles himself was acutely aware of the tension. He oscillated between moments of insight and episodes of terror, sometimes trusting the regents, other times suspecting them of conspiracy. He issued contradictory orders, withdrew from councils, and at times held elaborate investigations into imagined plots. The regents became mediators, strategists, and guardians, all navigating the dangerous waters of a mind that could erupt unpredictably. Externally, France remained vulnerable. English forces pressed forward, internal rebellions flared, and towns awaited direction from a king whose mind often seemed elsewhere. The regents acted as the kingdom's stabilizing force, yet they were never entirely free to govern independently. The fragile crown dictated their actions, and the shadow of Charles's paranoia loomed over every decision. As Charles entered the 1430s, the kingdom seemed perpetually on edge. His episodes of paranoia and delusion became more severe, often spilling into public events and influencing crucial political and military decisions. France walked a tightrope, balancing between survival and collapse, as the king's fragile mind dictated the rhythm of governance. Charles's internal world had become a labyrinth. Shadows, whispers, and imagined conspiracies guided his actions. He wandered palace corridors at night, sword in hand, issuing orders to invisible enemies, inspecting rooms, and speaking to shadows. Candles cast long, distorted shapes across the stone walls, reinforcing the king's fears. Servants, guards, and nobles had to adapt constantly, moving silently and carefully to avoid triggering another episode. Despite the instability, Charles's flashes of brilliance persisted. He could still negotiate treaties, provide strategic insight, and occasionally make decisions that saved France from disaster. These moments reinforced the paradox of the King of Glass: fragile, unstable, yet extraordinarily capable. Yet with every episode, the cracks in the crown widened, and the kingdom's stability rested on a delicate balance between fear, loyalty, and intuition. The regents' influence grew, as they attempted to guide the kingdom during periods when Charles withdrew from governance. Power struggles emerged, as alliances shifted, ambitions collided, and whispers of betrayal circulated in every corridor. France's survival depended not only on the king's moments of clarity but on the skill, cunning, and patience of those around him. And in the quiet hours, when shadows stretched across the palace halls and candlelight flickered against stone walls, Charles remained both ruler and prisoner. The crown, fragile and heavy, bound him to the kingdom, and the first cracks in glass, the whispers of paranoia and insight, continued to shape the destiny of France, a delicate and terrifying dance that would unfold in ways both brilliant and haunting. By the early 1430s, Charles's mind had become a battlefield of paranoia, fear, and fleeting genius. Each decision carried weight far beyond the palace walls, affecting France's alliances, military campaigns, and internal stability. Advisors and regents acted as intermediaries, translating the king's erratic commands into actionable policy, while also attempting to shield the kingdom from his more dangerous impulses. The king's episodes grew increasingly dramatic. On some days, he would refuse to see any court members, convinced that everyone plotted against him. On others, he would summon councils in the dead of night, interrogating attendants and nobles over conspiracies that existed only in his mind. These episodes often lasted hours, sometimes days, creating a ripple of tension across the palace and the kingdom. Despite the chaos, Charles retained flashes of brilliance. He could foresee military maneuvers, negotiate delicate alliances, and protect France from external threats. These rare moments reminded everyone that beneath the fragile, fractured exterior lay a ruler of extraordinary capability. Yet the crown, delicate as glass, weighed heavily on him, each crack in its symbolism reflected in the instability of his own mind. France, meanwhile, felt the consequences. Military campaigns stalled or shifted direction due to the king's unpredictable orders. Nobles and regents had to make rapid decisions to prevent disaster, balancing obedience to the crown with practical governance. The kingdom existed in a constant state of tension, a fragile dance dictated by a ruler trapped between brilliance and madness. The palace itself had transformed into a landscape of fear and vigilance. Charles wandered its corridors at night, sword in hand, whispering to shadows, inspecting doors and tapestries, issuing commands to invisible enemies. Candles flickered, casting long, shifting silhouettes across stone walls, reinforcing his paranoia. Guards and attendants moved silently, anticipating every step, every mood, every potential episode. Survival required constant attention and careful calculation. Charles's delusions extended to his closest advisors. He suspected plots, conspiracies, and betrayals where none existed. Even the most loyal nobles had to navigate his whims, balancing honesty, appeasement, and survival. Family members acted cautiously, aware that the fragile crown demanded obedience even when the king's perception of reality was fractured. Yet flashes of genius persisted. Charles could make strategic decisions, guide military campaigns, and provide insight that few could match. These moments reminded everyone that the King of Glass was not simply mad, he was brilliant, and his mind, though fragile, could shape France's destiny in ways that were both dangerous and extraordinary. The shadows in the palace grew longer, and the whispers inside the king's mind, the first cracks in glass, continued their relentless influence. France, the palace, and the fragile king existed in a delicate balance, each shaping the other, each dependent on the fragile brilliance and terror of Charles himself. And as candlelight flickered across the stone halls, the story of the King of Glass continued, a haunting tale of genius, madness, and the fragile crown that bound him to his kingdom. By the mid-1430s, Charles's mental instability began to have devastating effects on France's relationships with foreign powers. Alliances that had been painstakingly forged wavered under the weight of unpredictable commands and sudden refusals to negotiate. Ambassadors arrived with gifts and proposals, only to find themselves suspected of treachery, detained, or dismissed without reason. France's position in Europe teetered, as neighboring states interpreted the king's erratic behavior as weakness, opportunity, or both. Within the palace, the regents and advisors faced a delicate balancing act. They sought to maintain alliances while simultaneously managing the unpredictable demands of the king. Family members whispered behind closed doors, attempting to influence decisions, protect the kingdom, and preserve their own positions. The court had become a labyrinth of intrigue, where every move had to be calculated to survive both Charles's suspicion and the shifting tides of politics. The king's paranoia was relentless. He suspected envoys of poisoning, generals of collusion with the English, and even his closest advisors of plotting to seize power. Entire campaigns were altered not for strategy, but to satisfy his fears. France's military and diplomatic machinery became an extension of Charles's mind, brilliant in flashes, yet dangerously erratic. Despite this, moments of insight persisted. Charles could recognize threats before they materialized, offer solutions others would overlook, and preserve alliances with rare brilliance. These intermittent flashes reinforced the paradox of the King of Glass, fragile and unstable, yet capable of extraordinary feats. Yet every episode of paranoia widened the cracks in his crown, and France's survival rested on a knife's edge. By this stage, the tension within the palace and the kingdom had reached a climax. Charles's episodes became longer, more violent, and increasingly public. He wandered the corridors at night, sword in hand, speaking to shadows and invisible conspirators. He would interrogate servants, accuse ministers, and issue contradictory commands that threw governance into chaos. Candlelight flickered across stone walls, exaggerating shadows that seemed alive, feeding the king's fears. The regents and advisors were stretched to their limits. They acted as interpreters of the king's mind, mediators in crises, and guardians of France itself. Power struggles intensified as they tried to manage both internal court politics and the kingdom's external threats. Each decision required careful calculation, as a single misstep could provoke Charles's wrath and undo months of effort. Military campaigns suffered under the weight of the king's mental instability. Generals received conflicting orders, reinforcements were delayed, and alliances frayed. France survived, but barely, reliant on both the fleeting moments of clarity and the extraordinary skill of those surrounding the king. Every day was a battle, not just against external enemies, but within the fragile walls of the palace itself. And yet, amidst the chaos, Charles remained astonishingly capable at times. Decisions made in moments of lucidity saved the kingdom from disaster, preserving the paradox of a king both brilliant and broken. The whispers in his mind, the first cracks in glass, continued to guide his paranoia and intuition, shaping France's destiny in ways no one could fully predict. The fragile crown trembled on his head. The palace echoed with tension, fear, and whispered calculations. France, the regents, and the King of Glass were locked in a delicate, terrifying dance, where survival, loyalty, and brilliance collided. And as shadows lengthened across the stone halls, the story of Charles continued, a tale of genius, madness, and the precarious fate of a kingdom hanging on the fragile mind of a king. By the late 1430s, the palace had become a crucible of tension and hidden agendas. Charles's mental state had deteriorated further, and every decision, political, military, or personal, was influenced by paranoia and delusion. Advisors, regents, and family members navigated a minefield of suspicion, balancing loyalty to the king with the practical necessity of preserving the kingdom. Internal power struggles reached unprecedented intensity. Courtiers whispered behind tapestries, regents plotted to stabilize policies, and family members maneuvered to protect both their influence and the monarchy itself. Every meeting could erupt into chaos if Charles perceived betrayal, and even the smallest gestures could ignite fear or rage. Externally, France was both resilient and vulnerable. Wars continued, alliances wavered, and foreign powers watched closely, wary of the King of Glass. Yet despite these crises, Charles occasionally displayed brilliance. His insight into strategy, diplomacy, and governance remained unmatched, brief moments of genius that reminded all of the extraordinary ruler hidden within the fragile mind. The whispers inside Charles's head, the first cracks in glass, continued relentlessly. They guided paranoia and intuition, merging fear with insight, shaping both the king and the kingdom. Every action, every word, every decision was intertwined with these invisible forces, creating a court of shadows where the fragile crown weighed heavier with each passing day. In his final years, Charles's episodes grew longer and more severe. He wandered corridors for hours, conversed with shadows, and gave orders to invisible enemies. Candlelight flickered across walls, casting elongated, trembling silhouettes that seemed to mirror the turmoil in his mind. Attendants moved silently, guards stayed vigilant, and advisors tread carefully, interpreting the king's actions to maintain the stability of the kingdom. Even as his mind fractured further, flashes of brilliance endured. Charles could still plan military operations, assess diplomatic challenges, and make decisions that preserved France from total chaos. These moments were precious islands of clarity in a sea of fear and delusion, reinforcing the paradox of the King of Glass, a ruler both brilliant and broken, fragile yet commanding. The palace itself had become a symbol of the king's condition, corridors filled with shadows, halls echoing whispers, rooms transformed into stages for imagined conspiracies. France's survival relied on the courage, cunning, and loyalty of those who worked tirelessly to interpret the king's commands and shield the kingdom from his paranoia. And as the last candle flickered low, casting its final light across stone walls, the whispers inside Charles's mind persisted. They guided, haunted, and shaped the destiny of the King of Glass, ensuring that even in darkness, the story of his reign, fragile, brilliant, and terrifying, would never be forgotten. Charles's reign became legend, a tapestry of brilliance, madness, and fragility. France survived wars, rebellions, and political instability, largely thanks to the skill and resilience of his advisors, family, and regents. Yet the mark of Charles remained, a king whose mind shaped his kingdom as much through fear and delusion as through intelligence and strategy. Historians would remember him as the King of Glass, a sovereign whose brilliance was tempered by fragility, whose decisions were guided by both insight and paranoia. His life was a delicate balance between genius and madness, and his story offered lessons about power, vulnerability, and the human mind. The palace, now quiet, still bore the echoes of whispered conspiracies, candlelit corridors, and shadowed halls. France, forever marked by the fragile crown, carried forward the legacy of a ruler whose mind had been both a prison and a weapon, shaping a kingdom in ways both extraordinary and terrifying. Charles the Mad, the King of Glass, had left an indelible mark on history, a reminder that even the most brilliant mind can fracture, yet in that fragility lies a unique and haunting kind of power. And as our story comes to a close, let your mind wander with the whispers of the King of Glass. Imagine the candlelight flickering softly across the palace halls, the shadows stretching long and gentle. Remember, even the most fragile crown can hold brilliance within. Thank you for listening tonight. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe and join us again for another story that will carry you into calm, peaceful sleep. Good night.